The return of the spy drama The Sandbaggers brings a real-life mystery to this week's TV Times, the disappearance of the creator of the series. Meet two families bound to become TV favourites, and Faith Brown's daughter, Danielle, making an impression. Sandra Dickinson loves sweater dresses. We tell you how to knit this one. And don't miss the last week of our round-the-world gold rush.
I never knew there was so much in it.
All this, plus your exclusive 7-day guide to ITV, in this week's Big Value TV Times.
Battle of the Network shows. Join Rick Brooks and Mike Kogel as they explore the TV of the 70s and 80s through hand-picked episodes of their favorite and not-so-favorite series.
Welcome to another Battle of the Network shows. I'm Mike, and I'm here with Rick, and today, this is one of the 5 out of the 365 days of the year that we're kind of breaking the rules, I think. We're going to be talking about a show that technically didn't air on an American network. It eventually aired on PBS, I think in the late 80s, and again, going outside of the rules a little bit, the 90s.
Ooh.
But it's definitely a show of the late 70s and 80s. A British show called The Sandbaggers that aired on ITV between 1978 and 1980. I guess we could call it an espionage show, in a way. But as we get into it, you'll find out it's a little different than your James Bond espionage or even your search espionage.
Yes.
Instead, it has a different, one might say, more realistic focus. And I first heard about this show through comic book writer Greg Rucka, who did a series with a number of artists. It was called Queen and Country, and it was basically an homage to this show that he had watched on those PBS reruns, I think when he was in high school. And he actually named his main character after the friend he watched it. And I love that comic series. There are also a couple novels. And so when I finally got a chance to watch the show, I loved the show, but it stood out to me because, again, it's from 1978, and it is as sometimes intense and surprising and complicated as sort of your prestige American dramas of, today's period. The main character is often just pretty unlikable. I mean, he's not Tony Soprano, but he doesn't do anything to ingratiate himself to basically anyone, including the audience. And the first season especially has a number of things that you wouldn't have seen on American TV until, the last 10, 15 years, I think. Not like sex things, but some violence, and I don't want to spoil them because even though we spoil stuff all the time, I'm going to try to avoid spoiling that stuff. But and it hangs over the rest of the series, which is only 20 episodes. It's a British show, and it also kind of ended abruptly, which we'll get to soon. But honestly, it's probably one of my favorite TV shows. Like, once I saw it, and I just recently rewatched the whole thing, and which is another reason we're doing it now. I got excited about it again. Aha! So it's on DVD and on Tubi TV, and I think maybe BritBox or something.
Yes, it's out there for streaming on free and paid services.
Right. So, if you just look at it quickly, it looks like a lot of British TV of that era, which is the interiors are shot on videotape, sort of that soap opera look. I don't know if it seems like it's like a multi-camera thing too, when they're doing that. And so those interior scenes play a little bit like a play, and then exteriors are on very grainy film, which can be jarring, but if you've watched old Doctor Who or Monty Python even, and you adjust. But that kind of makes it look like it doesn't have good production values, but I think probably for the budget they had, it actually does have some pretty high production values. especially like some episodes they were able to go to Malta, so it give it a different look. There's one set in Gibraltar, which I think they shot there. Other ones that are supposedly somewhere else, they shot somewhere in England, but made it convincingly enough not England that you buy into it. And then the interior sets are sets obviously, but they have a lot of cool details. And like in this episode, there was something I liked that when they're they have a big map on the wall of their operations room, and to keep track of the time, they're putting different clocks set to the time zones of those, like, hanging them on the map, which was kind of a cool, weird detail. I guess we haven't really explained what it's about yet, but the clothing kind of matches the civil servant sort of look. Suits are ill-fitting on the main characters and things. And essentially what it's about is the operations division of the Secret Intelligence Service, or SIS, and more specifically the director of the operations division and his the operatives, who are called the Sandbaggers. And ideally there are three of them. In the episode we watched, there are only two, and these are kind of the people they send in for the most important missions. Like, they have people stationed in all over the world, but they're defectors or protection things. They might send in a sandbagger, or they need to extract someone, say, a double agent. They'll send them in. They usually don't have weapons, and in fact, Sandbagger 1, Willie, who's an important part of this episode, doesn't like having a gun. And sometimes they do a little investigating. Then there's also an intelligence side, and in the second series that plays into it more, and you meet, not in this episode, but you meet the director of intelligence, and then there are, of course, levels above them. So there's a deputy chief, and then C, who's the actual head of the department, and is I believe seems like a political appointment. Like the rest of the jobs are regular jobs, but he's an appointment. So the main character is Neil Burnside, who is the director of operations, and a lot of the conflict is his devotion to the mission of his department and what he thinks is the mission of SIS, and that up against sort of the political needs of England at the time, or Great Britain at the time.
Yeah, and SIS, real quickly, SIS is more, we're talking foreign intelligence.
Yes.
So it's like the equivalent, it's like MI6.
Yeah.
So it's more the equivalent of like the CIA, as opposed to MI5, I think, is the domestic, or kind of like the FBI deal. So
yeah, and in fact, there are episodes that deal with the conflicts between those two departments, because MI6 is not supposed to do things on British soil, and sometimes they need to. MI5 has certain territorial things that happen. So that's the basic premise, and I think so. It has high stakes, and yet to me it also plays like it's like a workplace drama, but just with higher stakes than normal. So a lot of if you generalize sort of the conflicts, they're conflicts that I think people would recognize, from being in a working environment. That sometimes you have something you want to get done and you can't get it done because the needs of the company are different than yours, or sometimes the needs of the company in terms of perception are different. And so you get into a lot of conflict that way, and even like this episode, Burnside is concerned about his future prospects in terms of promotion and things. So the episode, or the series, was created by a man named Ian Mackintosh, who was a naval officer. Apparently he was still a naval officer even when he was making the show. And he had made a show before that. Definitely he was. There's a lot of speculation that he was also involved in intelligence somehow. And I even read so the first series is 7 episodes, the third series is 7 episodes, the second one is 6. And he had to get all his scripts approved by the government to make sure he wasn't revealing any secrets. And apparently one got spiked. The other thing that's kind of interesting is, or really interesting, is so in 1979, he and a pilot and his girlfriend were flying a plane in Alaska and disappeared. The wreckage was never found, and the guy he was with was an experienced pilot, and Ian Mackintosh was some sort of aviation expert. And there's some stuff about the flight plan. They didn't file a flight plan, or they took a different flight plan than they filed, and no one knows what happened. And there are people, including his brother, who think he faked his own death. And I think at least some of the speculation, maybe even he defected to Russia. So, that's pretty interesting. And so that happened in 1979, and the third series was in production. I think the last episode was in production. But neither the second or third series both aired in 1980. He had already written all of those episodes, except for there are 3 in the third series, I think, that he didn't write. But I was kind of surprised by that when I read that even the second series hadn't aired yet. Anyway, I was thinking about that, and it reminded me a little bit of the Amelia Earhart situation that we talked about in our In Search Of episode. Someone who vanished under mysterious circumstances in an airplane. Some people thought she was working for the government. And in fact, it's going to be a surprise to you, Rick, our crack research team actually found some audio from a British attempt at doing a British-focused In Search Of.
What a coup. Yeah, this is a surprise to me, but a pleasant one.
It is one of the only things left from this attempt because, of course, in British television tradition, they reused all the tapes. So, but we were lucky that they found this.
Okay.
So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to play this for you in a second here.
Oh, please do. Yeah. I'm grateful to hear it.
Hang on. We got to do some technical things. Get our crack engineering team to help us out. But hang on just a second.
I spent time living in Jamesburg, New Jersey, in a place called Leisure World. I have been studying
Ian Mackintosh
for 17 years. I have over 1,000 photographs of
him
from the time
he
was a baby.
His
Her time in elementary and high school and all the other things that
he
did. I know more about
him
than I know about my mother.
Ian Mackintosh,
I believe, has taken on an identity of the name of Irene Bolam.
In 1965, Jervis meets this couple while delivering a lecture. He becomes convinced that this woman's true identity holds the proof to his theory.
And I went over and I met this couple, and I looked this lady straight in the face, and I knew who it was as soon as I looked at her.
Ian Mackintosh.
I would know
him
anywhere in the world.
It's a fantastic story which makes me out to be some kind of a mystery woman. It is utter nonsense.
I think
he's Ian Mackintosh.
Because this entire episode, is shrouded with mystery.
I am not a mystery woman. I am not
Ian Mackintosh.
Oh, I'm speechless. I'm speechless. I know this is a podcast where we're supposed to be talking, but words fail me. I mean, this may be the first time that our crack research team has really come through like this on something. I mean, I'm stunned.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what to make of this guy. This guy seems a little bit like a crackpot, but
yeah, it's very similar to the argument he made for the Amelia Earhart.
Yes, in fact, this woman he's accusing, or person posing as posing as a woman, whoever this is, even lives in the same place that the supposed Amelia Earhart lived.
Yeah, it strains credibility, but on the one hand, I mean, I don't discount this because this is, actual audio from, 40-some years ago.
Right, yeah.
And you can tell, listening to him, that he, at least, is committed to this theory. So I say, well, I'll hear him out. I think it warrants further investigation.
Right.
It's a shame that Leonard Nimoy's not around. I'd like to get his remembrances of, I guess he participated in this version.
Well,
of the show somehow.
from what the crack research team told me, they had to temp in. They used some of his narration as temporary audio.
I see.
But they were looking at some different people. Michael Palin, I think, was one of the options.
That makes sense.
One of the doctors who, I'm not sure which one.
Maybe the guy with the scarf?
I don't think the guy with the scarf, because
Okay.
I think he was too busy being Doctor Who at the time.
no,
I think
okay.
the guy before him,
Okay.
who I think his last name was Pertwee,
Okay.
the macho doctor,
Right.
I believe.
The macho doctor.
Yeah.
That's a topic for another podcast.
Right.
That surprises me more than that audio we just heard. But
Yeah.
anyways,
Diana Rigg, maybe.
Yeah. Did this actually air across the pond, as they say?
no,
Or was this,
no, they
that's a
didn't.
shame.
Yeah.
There would have been so it was a prototype. There's
Yeah, with a more British focus, and then I
Yeah.
think, the regular In Search Of did the Loch Ness Monster, and they're like, why do we need a special version?
yeah,
People here love Spock.
yeah,
Let's just air that one.
yeah. I see.
Yeah. And then if they wanted to cover something like this, they could have.
Yeah, Amelia Earhart or something like that. Some topics like that, or like some farmer that found crop circles in Kansas. They would, take a look at the pastoral countryside of the UK and maybe take a look at those kind of crop circles.
Yeah.
A little bit more Brit-centric version.
Right, they could have done, or even just recut regular episodes of In Search Of, like King Arthur and
Sure, that makes
things. I think it was a good idea.
Just didn't make it though, huh?
Yeah.
Well, so what do you think about this this alternate theory of the disappearance of Mackintosh? I mean,
Well,
does this hold any water?
I don't know. That seems awfully elaborate. Like
Yeah.
that he faked his death. That's intriguing. Who knows? Maybe he's just living on Kodiak Island. Apparently, he didn't even like being photographed. So I guess people don't really know what he looked like as much.
Well, anytime
Yeah,
you get intelligence, government intelligence involved, I wouldn't rule out anything.
right.
I certainly wouldn't rule this out.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by this, but I guess we'll never know.
No. Well, so there's a website called theopsroom.com, which is where I got some of this information. Not the In Search Of thing. That's our own crack research team, of course, but some of the basic information, and they actually even assisted in some of the special features on the DVDs.
Do they have like a theory about what?
They mentioned some of those theories. They don't. I think they offer the various speculation,
Boo!
especially by his brother.
I say go ahead and make a stand. I'm gonna take a stand right now, and I'm gonna tell you what I think happened. You know what I think happened?
What?
You want me to tell you what I think happened?
I want you to.
I'll tell you what I think happened. You go first, and then I'll tell you what I think
No,
happened. But, I don't want to.
I don't know what happened.
Well, that's
like
no
to hear
reason
what-
not to speculate on it.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop anybody else. Like I said, I wouldn't rule anything out, but it certainly seems mysterious.
It does seem mysterious.
I think, I'm gonna go against the living at leisure world theory as a woman. I'm gonna rule that one out for now. But it seems a little too. I don't think it's a random disappearance. There's just too many things that tie together. But anytime you get, the other thing is, anytime you get somebody from the intelligence field working in an entertainment field or anything really, it's kind of like the old thing. Well, you never really leave the service. There's always going to be speculation that the person is still active and is furthering some kind of intelligence goal by doing what he's doing.
That's right.
I don't know if that's the case with this series, but there's too many dots to connect here. So I think there's more to it than meets the eye. But what has happened in the last 40 years to make you think, oh, that has Roy McIntosh's or
Ian
Mackintosh, sorry, that has his fingerprints all over it.
Right.
Maybe he's just quietly living.
The TV has gotten better.
TV has gotten better, yes.
Maybe he's really Vince Gilligan.
Could be. I think it's fascinating too that in your introduction to the series, you compared this series with some of the more prestigious television that we have now, and yet now, thanks to our crack research team, we can also link it to some of the less prestigious television of yesteryear, such as In Search of. It's fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
As somebody might say with a raised eyebrow, fascinating.
Yeah. Here's what I would say. Maybe one day we could possibly find out what happened to Ian Mackintosh. But it's also possible we'll never find out. Only time will possibly tell us the answers to these questions.
Mate.
Yeah.
And that's
Right,
how they ended many of the prototype English versions.
That's right.
I think that's well said.
Yeah.
That's well said.
Right. So I guess we should...
Maybe we should talk
Back to
about
the
the actual show itself. The behind-the-scenes stuff is fascinating.
Right.
But the show itself is very intriguing as well.
Yeah. So the episode we're doing is from Series 2, as the English would say. And it's called Decision by Committee. And it aired in England on February 11th, 1980. The third episode of Series 2. So the middle episode. I should say also that most episodes have a mission at some point, and there's sort of a ticking clock, and this one is slightly different in that the mission has just ended. So Willie and a female CIA counterpart, Karen Milner, have been in Sri Lanka protecting some bigwigs at a conference because the SIS and CIA are concerned about some Iraqi terrorists seeking retribution because some of their terrorists were caught and put in prison in both England and New York, which I'm pretty sure is a reference to something like they got that information in a previous episode of the second series. I'm pretty sure. And nothing happened, and we see Willie and Karen sharing a drink at a Sri Lankan bar, and he's just secured them plane tickets, and we already get some information about sort of the state of the CIA versus the SIS. She gets a first class ticket back. He has to ride coach. He only gets to take first class on the way out, which in a previous episode, even that was an argument, that why do they need to do that? And the whole idea is that they're fresh when they arrive, wherever they're going to do their mission. But as he says, who cares what condition you're in when you come home? Simple enough. And then back at home, Burnside is getting his annual review from the deputy chief. I really enjoy this the actor and the performance of. He's sort of you just look at him and you think sort of snooty British guy. He's got a very well manicured mustache, and he's he seems just very, not entirely plugged in, and sort of like more of a suit than an actual guy who can do his job. And he wants everything to go by the rules, and Burnside is not a person who likes to follow the rules. As we said, he's so dedicated to the mission that he often does what characters like to call double dealing in order to accomplish his goals. And so in his annual review, that's not a positive mark from the deputy chief, who gives him, I believe it's called promotion in normal course, which that sounds fine. He hasn't been in his position long enough to be promoted yet, but eventually he will be.
Yeah, what's he? It's something like 19 months or something.
18, I think 18 months.
Okay,
yeah.
so a year and a half.
18,
he's been
19.
in this position.
Yeah, and before that he was a sandbagger, and as Burnside said, that's basically the kiss of death, and as far as he's concerned, because he wants to be deputy chief, and eventually he wants to be C. That's the only ladder he can see. But there are other jobs that are technically promotions, like being a, on site somewhere. And he says, basically this is setting him up to end up as station chief in Greenland or something where he has nothing to do. And even if he improves his behavior and follows the deputy chief's desire for decision by committee, then eventually, he'll get there's a different promotion thing, like early promotion. He'll get recommended for that. But Burnside, there are already too many people ahead of him, and he knows this is just no good. So that's sort of the tension at home at first. And then he goes and complains to his CIA counterpart, Jeff Ross, who is a pretty awesome recurring character. He's got it is an American actor, and he's just got like a nice weathered sort of acerbic wit about him. And he and Burnside are very much simpatico on a lot of things. But he has more resources, and like we see here, they go out for he pays for drinks at some fancy hotel, although he complains about the bill. And but when Burnside takes him out to lunch in other episodes, they go to McDonald's.
Yeah.
Burnside's thinking about quitting, and Ross is encouraging him to stick with it, and maybe do what they asked. And then we see Burnside at home, feeling sorry for himself, listening to I don't know what that music was. I tried to identify it, but I couldn't. But it is not what I would call cool music. Did it seem familiar to you?
It didn't really make a mark at all on me.
I don't even know if there's a genre.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's another episode where he's glum about something and wandering the streets, and at some point Baker Street is playing.
Yeah, I don't remember.
This is like not even as intense as that song.
Yeah, I don't remember him showing a lot of passion for contemporary pop culture throughout the series.
He's too busy.
Yeah. I mean, he seems like the kind of guy who would go home and like put some music on just because he thinks it's sort of what you have to do, but but that he's not really taking any inherent joy or getting relief from it. It's just he has it on because it's something to distract him or help him block out other things.
Maybe in a deleted scene, he went and bought a hi-fi.
Yeah,
and
could be.
And whatever record they had on display next to it.
Right. Just the demonstration record.
Right, and he came home and, well, this is what people do.
Yeah.
And he doesn't drink. Like, he stopped drinking when he took this job. So if he's drinking anything in that scene, it's a Coke.
Yeah.
But he's sitting on the floor listening to this music. And then he gets a phone call from the ops room. And the flight that Willie and Karen Milner were on, which is like a flight that has, I don't know, like 10 stops or something. Ridiculous. Like they're the second stop on it. It started in Kuala Lumpur, and them in Sri Lanka, and then at some point it was in Bahrain, and it got hijacked by the terrorists they were waiting for.
It seemed more like a train route than a flight plan.
Right. So, everybody, they rush in, and now it's all hands on deck in this ops room, and I really enjoyed like all those scenes, like the intensity of that. Like, I mean, it's basically people answering phones and looking at maps and talking, but because it is essentially, it seems like, again, multi-camera just happening on stage in front of you. There's not a lot of fancy sound design or anything, but just the phones going off and all the other noises, typewriters or teletypes or whatever is going on. Just there's a real intensity to it that I think in a way is more intense than like a big action scene would be.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hallmarks of this series. It shows you how the sausage is being made, so to speak.
Yeah.
And this episode, which I'm sure we'll get to, it does have some action sequences, and the series as a whole does. But usually the action sequences are more of a backdrop for explaining like the process, what goes into the action, what goes into the decisions and the ramifications of those. So it's not like, like Man from U.N.C.L.E. or something like that. It's more the behind the scenes and the bureaucracy and the mechanics of how foreign intelligence is run.
Exactly. So yeah, everybody comes in. They don't know why it was hijacked either, like why this flight is important. I mean, there's some British people on it. They wouldn't have known about Willie and Karen, and Burnside is hoping that the people on it, that whoever is important on it, are British, because then he can have some say in what's happening in the SAS, which is the Special Air Services, I think, can go in, and they mention later that they have had some successes in raiding airplanes that were hijacked, and I believe those are references to real events.
Yeah, that's another thing too. Is 1980, like in this 1970s, skyjacking was much more of a phenomenon than it is now.
Yeah,
and it was a pretty topical theme and a very real. Not that it isn't now, of course, but it was a very real concern and something that happened a lot more frequently back then.
They do reference contemporary things, and I think maybe in one of the Series 3 episodes they even kind of make a reference, it seems to be to Margaret Thatcher, who I don't think was Prime Minister yet when these were going on. Ross comes in, and he's in the ops room. He hopes, of course, that there are American bigwigs on there, and eventually they find out that there are two British defense people, pretty high up. I'm forgetting their designations, but they're people, and at least one of them is a knight already, a sir.
Yeah, I thought they were a little vague on actually what they were.
Chief, but CGE and CG, something like that.
Yeah,
they had their abbreviations.
High-level defense officials.
Yeah, who had been in Kuala Lumpur and not Sri Lanka. So then it's all about, Burnside wants them, once they land, they have to figure out where they're going to land, where the plane is going to, hijackers are going to ask the plane to go, and then, how do we deal with this? And his main concern is just Willie, because there is there's an unspoken thing that if one of the Sandbaggers is in trouble, that they'll help them. And that allows the Sandbaggers to do their job and not have to worry about that. If they get into a tight situation like this, they know there's backup.
Which seems to be a little contrary to what I think, as Americans, I think we would assume that it's sort of the opposite over here. Like, and maybe it's not that this is like an elite unit.
Yeah.
But I would think, like, and especially like in pop culture in general, with like American spies, it seems like the prevailing idea is that, well, you're expendable.
Right.
And if you take Mission Impossible, the whole idea is like it's all things being off the books, that we're not going to acknowledge you, and you're doing this at your own peril.
Yeah. I think there are two things there. One, like in this case, the people doing the job don't think of themselves as expendable. But it does seem like later that maybe people above them do. Mm-hmm. There are certain situations where they are concerned, but they're not concerned so much for the life of the person as they're in a situation where if they get caught, then they could be...
Will expose things.
Expose things, exactly. And so in those situations, the option might be something else that is not positive for the operative, let's say. So basically, the rest of the episode is Burnside trying to get this SAS team to go in. So the plane eventually gets diverted to Istanbul and is on the tarmac, doors open, air conditioning off, all of that, and they have demands. And if they want their prisoners freed, and if they're not, one of these guys will be shot at a certain time. I think 1800, I want to say, and then the other one will be shot at later. And they also threaten to blow up the whole plane. At least I think they threaten that, or maybe that is just they suspect they have kind of explosives. Yeah. This decision, though, is up to the cabinet, and Burnside usually has some pull with things. His ex-father-in-law is a lifetime bureaucrat, and he's the undersecretary of the Foreign Office, the FCO. And so usually, at least once an episode, Burnside will go talk to him. His name's Wellingham, and he's a very kind of a little bit oily, I think. But he's a go-between between the government and the SIS.
Right, and he often provides, sort of wisdom, but at the same time, sometimes he's trying to prevent Burnside from his own quote-unquote worst instincts. And
yes, and also he quite often has his own agenda.
Yes.
That is sometimes the government's agenda and sometimes his agenda for the government.
Right.
Or his agenda for himself and his legacy, which the deputy chief, Peel, has a little bit of that too. Like they're in a position where, they can get knighthoods and things, and so they want to get as high up the peerage as they can, and they have a reputation to maintain. Whereas Burnside and the Sandbaggers come from more working class background, and their focus is on the job. So anyway, we get one of those scenes. Actually, Burnside and C, the head, go over there, and C gives Burnside a little lecture on, again, his review. And he likes him, but he had to sign. He agreed with Peel's opinions and kind of signed off on this review. And whereas Burnside, his thing is that if he thinks, one, the British masses don't care what they're doing, and if they did, they would just want them to accomplish their goal of the complete destruction of the KGB by whatever means necessary. I think that's almost a direct quote. And part of, I guess, why why he wants promotion is that so he can have more power to accomplish these goals. Like, it doesn't seem like he wants power for the sake of power. He wants it for what it can do.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting conflicts of this episode. It manifests itself with the whole series, is that you have a guy that in Burnside who shows open contempt for the bureaucracy and some of the rules and regulations, yet he's ambitious enough to want to get into the position where presumably he would be even more subject to those things.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, he would have the power to give his replacement, permission to do some of the things he doesn't get permission but does anyway.
Right.
But I think that's an interesting conflict in the character. He's ambitious enough to want to rise through the ranks, as you say, maybe for different reasons than other people, but at the same time, he's clearly contemptuous of much of that power structure.
Yeah, and I think also the writing and other characters sometimes, question is he actually that noble? Or does he just want to, power for the reason for power, the way a lot of people do?
Right.
Or is it somewhere in between, like a lot of people?
And I think like characters like the deputy chief, who's a frequent foil for Burnside throughout the series, he often comes off as a rather unsympathetic character. Mm-hmm. I mean, more of a bureaucrat, more of a functionary, almost a stooge sometimes, and more directly concerned with his own position. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's always wrong. And in some cases, he's actually quite right. And if you think about it, like his assessment of Burnside in the review, I mean, just from what we learned, I mean, he's not wrong.
No, he's not.
And you could make the argument, and the series does get into this sometimes. You can make the argument, what is the right way? I mean, perhaps the system does work better when you have people functioning as part of a system rather than, renegades going out on their own and doing their own things.
Yeah.
But it's always complex, and one of the brilliant things about the series is it captures the intrigue and the political nature of really everything, because you talk about people doing things for their own motives. A lot of times there's internal politics as far as people preserving their own positions, but there's also the political concerns of serving the current prime minister. Mm-hmm. That's always a consideration, and decisions are often played out based on how they will affect the political standing of whoever's in charge.
Yeah.
There are very few people that are even open about having, or that even alleged to have pure intentions, and that's one of the things I think that makes the series so good, is that intrigue that goes on throughout just about every episode, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And, later in this episode, we have a number of people telling Burnside that he's, like, this backup plan that he comes up with is just a bad idea. And based on what they're saying, I have to agree with them.
Well, including
the person who would do it.
He goes to.
Yeah.
Pretty much tells on him.
Right, yeah. And he feels weird about it, but yeah, so they're discussing it are they going to release the prisoners? Are they going to let the SAS go do their thing? And apparently, the SAS is ready. As soon as the hijacking got announced, they got ready and can go at a moment's notice, although it takes 4.5 hours or something to get to Turkey. And so he comes up after talking the other sandbagger, Mike Wallace, taking a break from 60 Minutes to be a British spy.
A versatile individual.
Looking very youthful, though.
Indeed.
He was only like 75 then or something, right? No, Mike had training with that in some of these SAS procedures, and he asked what would it take, how many people and stuff, and then he's like, well, can we use their like special projects team who goes in and blows up bridges and kind of things like that. And Mike says that's a bad idea. And he brings in the special projects guy, and he says, that's a bad idea. I don't want to do this. And then, he goes immediately to Peel to tattle. But that guy is conflicted about it, and I enjoyed that because that guy was a very, like, chest puffed out sort of British. I like Burnside, I really do, but I feel strange about this.
I mean, we don't see any internal thinking from that character. There's really no reason there's no reason to doubt his sincerity.
Yeah.
He does seem to... He's doing this because he feels that it's a bad idea all around.
Yeah.
Not because he doesn't want to do it or he's, afraid of something that'll...
And he's coming from basically the same place as Burnside, which is to protect his team.
Right.
I mean, their lives, not their reputation or whatever, but... And possibly protect the people on the plane. Like, they don't have the equipment for it. They're not trained to do it. It's just not... They're not the people to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, that's... As you said, that's Burnside's big thing is protecting a sandbagger.
Yeah.
There's surprisingly little discussion of the other British nationals that are on that flight.
Right.
I mean, I guess the cabinet for them that is their main concern, but it's almost like it's almost like an abstract thing. Like they could be any British people, and they'd probably be treating it the same way.
Right, and I believe Burnside has like a second meeting with Wellingham, and Wellingham says that, and he's like, well, I don't know them.
Yeah, it's Burnside. Yeah.
No, they don't work for me.
Yeah.
Like, and he's talking about the bigwigs, so even then, it's really just about those two guys. And I think when Burnside first tells C about the hijacking, he says, how many British people there are, and including so-and-so women and children, and C says, oh, children, ugh.
Yeah.
Basically, and now we have to do something, but...
Yeah, and when Burnside says he doesn't know them, the response he gets is, well, in the cabinet, they don't know Willie.
Yeah.
And Burnside's like, whoa, totally got me there, dude. He doesn't say it, but you can tell in his eyes that's what he's thinking.
Yeah.
Because it's a good rejoinder.
It is, yeah. So, in the end, we do, well, I won't say the end yet. We do get scenes of what's going on in the plane. So, I think there are 5 terrorists.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many there are exactly.
There are 3 who seem to actually be Iraqi. Mm-hmm. And then there are 2, I think they might be German, and I think that goes back to the other. So they're not Iraqi in the sense, I mean, I don't know exactly what their agenda is. But it may be like a free Iraq kind of thing or something, but there were some other German terrorists who were somehow involved with that came up in another episode. So I think it's 3 men or 4 men and a woman, and we see what's going on there. Karen picks out, like, she figures out what they're after, and she either she's in first class, of course, so she overheard them, or maybe even could translate what they were saying if it wasn't in English. And she kind of writes it on an envelope, and then this old lady wants to go to the bathroom, and they make a big fuss about that, and finally let her, but someone's going to have to watch her. And then Karen immediately gets up to go to the bathroom in the back, and the hijacker gives her a problem, and she's she calls him Buster. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
She might have tipped her hand a little bit there, but she's like, I can either go aft or pee right here, and it'll smell real bad.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
And as she's walking back, she drops his envelope on Willie's lap so he can find out what's going on.
Yeah, the terrorists have no idea that they've got, these trained intelligence operatives on their plane.
Right.
Willie wasn't wearing his Sandbagger #1 T-shirt that he often wears when he's on international travel.
Right.
So he was pretty much incognito.
Yeah. But it is a tense, everyone's sweating, of course, because it's really hot, and, and babies are crying, and they're old people, and it's not a good situation, of course. It's a hijacking. But I think they do a good job of portraying just the sense of tension there, too. Like, what's going to happen.
Yeah, and the claustrophobia being aboard the plane.
And these terrorists are really on edge, too.
Yeah, they're jittery, and they don't seem... they don't necessarily seem to be real professional in the sense of brilliant masterminds.
No.
They seem to be doing a lot of it on the fly, or and there's an edginess to them that sort of indicates that they're not exactly sure how it's going to end up themselves.
Yeah. So we get those scenes intercut with what's going on back at home, and that adds to the tension of all of that, and the ticking clock and everything, and then finally we get the final scene. It's time for the first defense guy to get killed. The British haven't met their demands, and they basically decide they're not going to. And that's, again, a politics thing. We actually find that there are two politics things going on. One is that they had already made, a public announcement that they wouldn't negotiate with terrorists, so now if they do, it looks like they went back on their word. The other thing, and that's understandable. I mean, they're both kind of understandable. But
that's partly encouraged by the Americans, correct?
Yes. Yeah, because, of course, the Americans have that stance, too. The other one is that the SAS has been so successful these other two times that they don't want even the possibility of them not being successful to happen. So there's no way they're going to send them in, because what if they fail? Then it looks like they're not good at their job. And that, I get it, but it seems so absurd.
Yeah. The whole, they say the risk of failure is unacceptable.
Yeah.
And if you just put it like that, that sort of makes sense. But the way, you just explained it, which is how kind of it is they're thinking that, that does seem absurd.
Yeah, so the best thing to do is nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, happen. People do that in their lives, and it's a safe thing to do, but this is not one person's life, it's hundreds of people's lives.
And it kind of ties in with Burnside's argument, who's more of thinking like, look, they don't care as long as we take down the KGB, the public's not going to sweat individual missions as much as the thinking is that they will.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absurd thing. I'm sure that kind of, that's the kind of thing that is always considered in any situation like this in real life.
Yeah.
But it's not like there's some kind of organizational prestige rating that they would slide down if they failed. It would be more like, no, there's a tragedy that happened. But it seems a bit of a leap to me in this situation that they sort of made it sound like the reputation of the entire institution is at stake on one mission. Yeah.
And their reputation is that they're the best. Yeah, it's like a PR thing, basically.
And although one could argue, now if you made the argument like, we've got like a 2% chance of doing this.
Yeah.
So that's the reason, combining those two things, that makes a little bit more sense if you think about like it's such a bad setup to fail mission that why throw away, all of the capital we've earned on a suicide mission.
Yeah.
That's one thing, but they don't really say it like that.
Right. That's the one thing. We don't see what the SAS, like what their opinion of this thing is. And maybe but it doesn't, I feel like that Wellingham would have said this is part of the SAS told us they can't succeed. I know one of the concerns is that after these other raids that the terrorists are more prepared for that and might just blow up the whole plane because they know they're going to die anyway.
Yes.
Which, unfortunately is, we know in our present day, there's some truth to that. Yeah, but it struck me as absurd and depressing in a way. So on the plane, they get the guy up, they're going to execute him, they make him kneel, and at that point, Willie yells, "Go, Karen," and we get this action scene that I double check. It's like 25 seconds, and I feel like it's probably in real life that's how fast something like it might be even too fast or too slow for like a real thing. And it's just, and I'm sure some of it's their budget again. There are a lot of quick cuts and things, but she manages to take down the first guy with his gun, grab his gun, shoot another guy. Then Willie gets involved, takes down the woman near him and gets her gun, and there's a shootout. And they eventually get everyone. Well, eventually, in 25 seconds.
Yeah.
They take down everyone, and then they find one of them threatened to blow everyone up, and they open his bag, and they're just wires going into a bag. There's no bomb. Right. And then a couple of people did get shot in the shootout, presumably by the terrorists. That was a little unclear, but a girl and an old man both got shot. But it's like a really powerful sequence, I think. Partly because it's so short and quick cut, but not, I don't think in a way that's meant to be confusing.
No, I don't think so either.
It's just to ratchet up and to, again, I think, feel as realistic as they can make it, which, again, is the nature of the show, where, another kind of show or movie might do it a lot of slow motion and all sorts of nonsense. But
yeah, it feels more stripped down. It's unsettling.
Yeah.
Which is very much in keeping with the overall tone of the show.
Yeah. And then there's Willie comes home and Burnside lies to him about what happened. And Willie's like, "Yeah, I knew you were working on something." Now, do you feel like he believes that?
Well, it's interesting how they do that. So yeah, they're having the conversation, and Burnside says something, about, you need a warrior or something, and yeah, Willie says, "Yeah, I knew you wouldn't leave me hanging," or something,
Yeah.
"I knew you wouldn't leave me," and it's kind of offhand the way they present it. He's, as I recall, he's on his way out the door, so you don't really see his face. They don't emphasize it. They show, you see both guys in the room, so you're more focused probably on Burnside because Willie kind of says it very casually as he leaves the room.
Yeah.
It's a very dramatic line because we know that Burnside was struggling with this the whole episode. And so you're asking, do you think that Willie believes that? The way they present it, it's certainly, I think the idea is that Willie does think that. Willie's opinion is that regardless of what everybody else says above him, that Neil would have found a way one way or another to get him out of there, or at least try.
I think he believes, which is true. He was trying. And I think he believes that. I know, though, from other episodes that he's aware enough of all the games and things that go on that, and Burnside was sort of mentioned. It's the cabinet was doing their usual decision by committee, blah. And, so he tells a half-truth. Mm-hmm. And, but then he says, but SAS would have been, was ready to go in. Mm-hmm. And that part's not true. And yeah, I feel like, Willie might get that Burnside was working for him for his safety, but that the things above him might have prevented that.
Yeah, I think by this point Willie knows that.
He's been doing this a long
he knows
time.
That Burnside's been, is not above going off the books if need be.
Oh no, because he often is the one.
So yeah,
either telling him not to go off the books or encouraging him to go off the books.
So I think that's how I interpret it, is that it's more of like internally among the Sandbaggers, we have each other's back no matter what else is going on. So that's kind of how I interpret it, and I do think, now that you mentioned it, I'm struck by how they presented that. It's more the focus on Burnside, left to wonder, how far would he have had to go with it. Yeah. Whereas Willie just doesn't even really give it a second thought, which is probably for the best, the way Burnside handled that conversation.
Right. And then Burnside also has a brief conversation with Peel in which he seems like he sees what Willie and Karen did by going off the books as a victory and a dismissal of the idea of decision by committee, and Peel doesn't see it at all. Yeah. He says, well, when you're here, you have to play within the rules.
Right. His point, that he's got agents out in the field making decisions in real time and did what needed to be done, and look, it worked. Yeah. So he's got a point.
Right. Comparing it to now, or comparing it to even, the fun of something like Search, and they had no way of contacting them. Like today, there might be ways to do it now, or, a similar thing had happened on Search, they could have at least, I feel like something did happen on there, actually, like a little bit like this, where, the probe operative could at least communicate by saying yes or no. He had a tooth implant, and it would beep yes or no, or at least and they could watch what was happening.
Right, at least giving them access to see what was happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a thing you see on this show a lot. That at some point they just don't know what's happening. They have to have some faith in what's going on, and there are lots of telephone calls, not cell phone calls. Yeah. People going back to places to make a telephone call.
And that's part of what this show gets at is, the Sandbaggers, it's in many ways, it's a lonely, isolated life. And, when you're a Sandbagger, you're out in the field, you're often, many times, as we see in the series, you're cut off from other contact. Yeah. You're left to your own devices. And just sort of the loneliness of Neil, who's, for better or for worse, he's married to this job. As you mentioned, he has an ex-wife. He doesn't really have much of a personal life, but clearly he's grappling with his own interior thoughts, and it just seems like a lonely and kind of isolated life, dealing with all these dealing with this bureaucracy, trying to do what's right.
And like Ross is always encouraging him to go do stuff, and actually, like he tried to set up Karen and Neil, and that didn't go anywhere partly because of that just a job, and partly because of what happened in the first series. But it definitely seems like a lonely job, and of course, just like that, you can get called in the middle of the night to go into work.
Yeah, and there's the accountability there. Like Neil sort of has the pressures, even though right now he's only got 2 Sandbaggers, but for us watching, it feels proportionately it's not just 2 Sandbaggers. He's got the whole department and something more as far as the interest of the country too. But the buck stops with him in a lot of these operational decisions. So he goes to other people for advice, and he gets their input. But ultimately, he's got the burden of making some of these decisions, not making the decisions, going against his superiors, and you can tell he really internalizes that, and that's why was it Roy Marsden? Yeah. I mean, it's such a brilliant performance throughout the whole series. He's so good, and you can definitely see all this stuff grinding on him as the series progresses.
Yeah, definitely. And I like his, beyond the performance, his physical presence is interesting. Like he's sort of a tall, lanky person, so he's in a way physically imposing, but he's not like broad. Right. I mean, just is an interesting looking guy, and then Ray Lonan as Willie is great, and he's just definitely brings that sort of that he's a working class guy attitude to it.
Yeah.
Also does a lot of Humphrey Bogart impressions for some reason.
Yeah.
Which I feel like might just be a Ray Lonan thing. And they were like, oh, do that. But, yeah, the acting is good. And even the sort of people, Peel and Willingham, I think, again, I don't think, they're probably not like that in real life, but they're able to embody these sort of British stereotypes a little bit.
Yeah, and as we know, like, class is such a more real concern, more explicit concern in British television, especially of that era. And that's a good point you made. It's definitely part of what's going on.
Yeah, and they're little
Sandbaggers
signifiers of that, I mean, and I'm sure if you're British, they stand out even more. But the clothes I mentioned, and Peel has this little thing that he carries with him for putting, I think, sugar in his tea.
Yeah.
There's a little device that he taps a couple of times. And
like social clubs and
yes.
things like that, make appearances and society.
In the very first episode, like at the end, Burnside says something like, if you're looking for James Bond, go to the library. And that's definitely like the ethos of the show. Mm-hmm. Not James Bond is, of course, entertaining in its own way. But this is definitely, I would say, in keeping with like John le Carré kind of stuff, although I just read some of his books recently and watched one of the miniseries with Alec Guinness based on those, and it definitely seems more on the intelligence side. And so those characters tend to be like the Smiley, the famous character he wrote about that Alec Guinness played in that, is definitely like an upper class Oxford kind of guy. Mm-hmm. So there's a different element to it, but there's a similar that it's just grounded thing, and that the elements of bureaucracy and some of it is just paperwork, and the set design, the furniture and stuff in that place is kind of awful. And
yeah, I think that's one of the cool things about the Sandbaggers, I think, is that it's that mix of realism and almost unreal, like surrealism or unrealism. Like you mentioned, the film sequences, the location shooting, or even just scenes where like Burnside and Ross are sitting on a park bench or something talking. Like sort of the outdoor shooting gives it sort of a gritty feel to it.
Yeah.
And then in the offices, and where a lot of the quote unquote action takes place, because it has that British video look, and the sets are often sparse, or they just have that look to it. It's almost like an intentional unrealism, but everything is stripped down, but it works. It's almost like a stylized lack of style in the interiors.
Right.
I think that gives it actually makes some of those the occasional outdoor adventure scene, things like that. It makes it stand out all the more to me. But overall, I think it works quite well for the whole series.
Yeah, it's one of those shows too that's like both procedural and serialized. Not super serialized, but the stuff that, like I kind of alluded to, stuff that happens before affects stuff that happens after. So it's not procedural in that sense. Like there's an overall arc, and I think in the second series they introduce like the director of intelligence, and it's like, okay, well, there's a new character, and then by the end, like a whole episode is about something involving him.
Yeah, and
it's like it's one of those things that, like, oh, you've been planting these seeds here, and now we're seeing it, and I find that pretty effective. Like, if I were to compare it to an American show, I'd say like Homicide, Life on the Street would be the obvious, because it has a number of similar things, that element, and especially in the early seasons, the sort of like bland looking set, very just government furniture sort of architecture kind of thing, and a certain amount of that bureaucratic tension too.
Yeah, I think this episode is a very good representation of what the Sandbaggers is about, because of the moral choices, the decisions, the way things are done in the episode. It's a good showcase for what it is, and it's hard for me to say, but I think someone could go in interested in appreciate what the show is about just by watching this episode.
Yeah.
However, as with many things, and you can tell just from our discussion here, if you see like the handful of, the 8 or 9 episodes before this one, you would definitely appreciate all this stuff a lot more.
Yeah.
So,
because I think the things that happened before maybe influence what Burnside's doing now, even more than just his belief in the job.
Yeah. I think anybody that's interested in this show, and I think the reason to watch the Sandbaggers is because you are interested in the intrigue, the bureaucracy, which might sound uninteresting, but the writing is so excellent. Everything it's grounded in. I don't know what British intelligence is like personally, but it feels like reality, and everything has consequences within an episode. And as we've said, over the course of the series, things have consequences. So you're rewarded, and really, I think the episodes just fly by. And whether there's a shootout on a plane or not in an episode,
right. Just
seeing the way Burnside handles things and seeing the maneuvering of him and the characters around him, I find that very fascinating. And it's like I watched the first season of Game of Thrones, and it wasn't the dragons that interested me; it was the politics that intrigued.
Right.
The intrigue and the jockeying for position.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that shows up in the Sandbaggers. And if that sort of thing interests you, then I would recommend you seek out the series from the beginning and watch it from the beginning, and you'll know pretty quickly if it's your kind of thing.
Absolutely. And then if you need a breather, watch some Search.
True. that would work as well.
Right.
I mean, I think another way this series breaks the rules for our podcast is we didn't watch the show when it was on, and we didn't really watch it any time after it.
No.
So for me, you got me into this show,
right.
And I'm glad you did, because once I started getting into it, I was hooked. It doesn't take long, I think, to appreciate it. Now, some people, the visual style of it is jarring. I think you did a good job of explaining, what it's like to people that might not be familiar with it. But if you can get, quote unquote, get past that, I mean, for me, it actually works for what the show is. That sort of stripped down, ethic to the show. But other people, it might not be for everybody. Yeah.
And then if you enjoy that, I would also recommend the comics I mentioned before, Queen and Country, because they definitely are the descendant of this show, and have a lot of the same. It's a little more focused on the I would say the field operatives than, so there's a little bit of a reversal there, but it is still a lot of the office stuff is going on, and the equivalent of Burnside is like the second lead character rather than the first, but definitely that's worth checking out. And everything you just said, go seek this out. I would say within probably by the end of the first episode you'll know, but certainly if you're a little on the fence, then watch the second episode, and that's one of that'll just sell you on it, I think. Especially again if you're a fan of like the current kind of prestige drama that's out there.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent series, and it's one of my, quickly became one of my favorite British series, and I enjoyed revisiting it for the podcast. But I also think it's underappreciated, especially here in the United States. I don't think I'd ever even heard of this show until you mentioned.
I mentioned it certainly, and maybe one day we'll know what happened to Ian Mackintosh, or not.
Well, we'll get the crack research team. Continuing to work on it, and maybe they'll turn up some more evidence.
Right, and unless them, doing that research would lead to failure.
Yeah, in that case, all
better,
bets are off.
Better to do nothing in that case.
Exactly. This episode brought to you by Abbreviations R Us, ARU, for all your abbreviation needs, FAYAN. This episode also brought to you by the destruction of the KGB by whatever means available. This episode also brought to you by... Hold on, we're still waiting on final confirmation from the sponsors committee. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Battle of the Network Shows. Learn more, leave feedback, and suggest future episodes at battleofthenetworkshows.com. Follow us on Twitter at BatNetShows, and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/battleofthenetworkshows.
He. Him. He. Him. Man. His. Ian Mackintosh. Ian Mackintosh?